For the title called The Ocean of Churn by Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, and we would like to invite you to be part of it. Please do take your seats. The event will begin shortly. It was immense pleasure to host the launch of the book The Ocean of Churn. Please welcome on stage the chief guest Mr. Vishwanathan Anand and author Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. He became India's first Grandmaster in 1988. He held the FIDE World Chess Championship from 2000 to 2002. He became the undisputed world champion in 2007 and defended his title against Vladimir Kramnik in 2008. He then defended his title in World Chess Championship 2010 against Vasilin Topalov and in World Chess Championship 2012 against Boris Gelfand. In April 2006, he became the fourth player in history to pass 2800 ELO mark on the 5 rating list. He occupied the number 1 position for 21 months, the 6th longest on record. He was also the first recipient of the Rajiv Gandhi Khel Ratna Award 9192, India's highest sporting honor. In 2007, he was awarded India's second highest civilian award, the Padma Vibhushan, making him the first sports person to receive the award. He started learning chess from the age of 6, from his mother and a close family friend. So there's so much to his credentials that it's difficult to accommodate all of them. Keeping it short, ladies and gentlemen, the pride of India and the chief guest, Mr. Vishwanathan Anand. An internationally acclaimed economist, best-selling author, and urban theorist, he was Deutsche Bank Global Strategist and Managing Director till end 2015, and was named Young Global Leader 2010 by the World Economic Forum in 2007. In 2007, he was awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship for his work on urban dynamics and was also honored by the Singapore government at the World Cities Summit 2014. He has been a visiting scholar at Oxford University, adjunct fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore, and a senior fellow of the Worldwide Fund for Nature. He currently serves as a member of Future City Committee of the Singapore government, tasked with building an economic and urban strategy for the city-state for the next 15 years. He attended Sri Ram College of Commerce, Delhi, and Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar 92 to 95. His previous best-selling books include Land of Seven Rivers, an Odyssey bestseller, The Indian Renaissance and the Incredible History of India's Geography, all published by Penguin. In addition, he has published around 150 articles, columns, and reports in leading national and international publications. He was given the inaugural International Indian Achievers Award for contributions to literature in 2014. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, London, and IDFC Institute, Mumbai. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. I would request Mr. T.S. Ashwin, MD, Odyssey, to present mementos to the chief guest and the author. I would request chief guest Mr. Vishwanathan Anand to start today's session by unwrapping the book, The Ocean of Churn. I would request Chief Guest Mr. Vishwanathan Anand to say a few words.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll just sit from here on. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm a bit surprised as well to find myself here at the launch of a book
about the history, especially a book about the history of the Indian Ocean. But what I found very interesting, well, let's say the author, Sanjeev, isn't a historian, or maybe more accurately, isn't a full-time historian. However, he's clearly very curious about the subject, and because of the varying professions he's had, he brings a very interesting perspective. The thing about India's history is, at least the way I learned it in school, it's heavily distorted. You have, towards the west, I can tell you at least the centuries in which certain events happened, and maybe the interaction wasn't enjoyable, but I can tell you what happened. And in fact, recently, thanks to maybe language, we tend to look towards England and America, or if you look at the Gulf, we trade more with Dubai than with Pakistan, so skewed in one direction. I had very little knowledge about what India has been doing for all these centuries towards the east. When you first start traveling and you go to the Gulf, the thing that strikes you is how many words they've absorbed from our languages and how many words of theirs we use. Similarities in the food. But this maybe isn't such a big surprise because clearly our history is intertwined. With the East, I always found the connections more tantalizing. You have things like the temples in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Cambodia. The fact that Indonesia has an airline called Garuda, that Bali has a huge Hindu culture. When I went to Oman recently, it's kind of fortunate that I happened to go just this year. What struck me again is the depth of the Indian connections. And you always find that these connections didn't start just after independence, that they go back much, much longer. So it was fascinating to read the book and try and get, catch up on all the details, the questions that you have. On Madras Week, it's nice to start a book which begins talking about the Pallava kings. And if after reading the book, you can tell me which century I'm talking about when I mention the naval vessel Emden, that's a good start. So there are surprising bits that I was totally unaware of, and fine. Right, but I think we're eagerly waiting to hear him. So let's get started.
Yeah.
I request Mr. Sandeep Sanyal to take the evening forward by talking about his book and share his experience of writing it.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking Odyssey and Penguin Books for organizing this evening. And of course, Mr. Anand for taking time off this evening. And very kindly also for the last few days reading my book, which is not just it's a fair amount of commitment given his other commitments and tournaments and so on. So it's been a real pleasure to interact with him. So why did I write the book? And I think you touched upon some of this. Is partly as revenge for those textbooks I had to read growing up. And jokes apart, the fact is that our history, that of the textbooks and other things that we read, is oddly enough very, very skewed towards the history, essentially, of Delhi. So you can grow up in India and basically learn the history of obscure dynasties who happen to rule Delhi, but then there are huge bits of India that are simply left out of the narrative. So you never hear about the Cholas and Pallavas in the national curriculum, maybe here in the local curriculums. You probably hear almost nothing about the Odia, who were one of the great mariners of the ancient world. You hear very little about Muziris or Muchiripatnam, which was one of the biggest ports in the world, as well as Tamralippi, another of the world's greatest ports, and so on. And so we have this great maritime culture that this skewed Delhi-centric view of history, this inland view of history, tends to give you a very peculiar view. Although, given the recent floods in Gurgaon and Delhi, I have been told that I should write a maritime history of Delhi. However, other people have indeed written about the Indian Ocean, but almost all of it has been written from a Western perspective. So while the national narrative is very inland, there have been others who have written about the Indian Ocean, but almost all of them are from the Western perspective. Now, what this does is that you have a perfunctory chapter in the beginning, which gives you the impression that people in the Indian Ocean region, the Indians, Indonesians, etc., were basically, before the Europeans arrived, they were basically the only thing they did was grow spices for Western market. And that we didn't have in independent existence our culture, our kings, our interactions. We didn't have very much. There'll be a perfunctory chapter in the beginning. Yes, they were growing spices and exporting it to Venice or whatever. And then the history really gets going with Vasco da Gama. This is really skews the way we think about the world, because not only does it completely leave out our very long maritime history, it also ends up making us think about the world from a very Western perspective. And so, most of these books also end when the Europeans leave, as if subsequently we don't have much of a history. So, the rise of Dubai or Singapore, the current rise of India, so it's quite a peculiar way of looking at the world, and I thought it was important that I sort of set the record straight, in a sense. They want me to see you. Should I get up and speak? Yeah. Okay, should I go there and speak? Let's stand up and speak. What I'm going to do is, rather than, sit here, and like this, maybe it works. But I'm going to read a little bit of a passage from the book, and then we can have a conversation. Yeah? Is that good?
Maybe you can go there.
Okay, I'll go there and speak.
Yep.
Sounds good. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Although I've been told I don't need a mic, I have a loud voice. Okay, I'm going to read the very last section of the book. Because one of the things I try to do in this book is to show that it's not just great people and great men and women who made history. They're ordinary people who are a very important part of history, and they participated in all kinds of ways and influenced it in all kinds of ways. So I'm reading the very, very last section of the book, so it'll give you a flavor of the writing style and the emphasis. While researching this book, I also came across numerous instances of how the lives of ordinary individuals have been impacted by the churn of people and empires in the Indian Ocean. Take, for example, the story of Udakkal Muhammad, who was born on 15th of August 1927 in Mundapalam, now in the state of Kerala. His family claimed descent from Yemeni merchants who had settled here in the 14th century. In 1942, when barely 15, he was thrown out of school for wearing a black badge in protest against the arrest of Mahatma Gandhi. Too scared of being scolded by his father for this, Muhammad decided to run away from home and eventually became an electrical artificer in the Royal Indian Navy. The Second World War was raging at this time, and Muhammad saw action on a number of occasions. After the war, he was posted to Bombay, where he participated in the Royal Indian Navy revolt of 1946. When the mutiny was suppressed, he was dismissed from the Navy with a certificate that said, "Discharged in disgrace from His Majesty's service." Muhammad tore off the paper and flung it at the British officer. The following year, India became independent on his 20th birthday. Since the mutineers were never reabsorbed into the Navy, Muhammad tried his hand at many jobs before getting involved in protests against the Portuguese rule in Goa in 1955. He was arrested by the Portuguese and spent some time in prison before being released. After many more adventures, including cycling across India, he became a tour guide in Agra, where he met and married a Syrian Christian nurse Mariamma on 15th of August 1964. Decades later, he would return to his village in Kerala, where he was living at the time that this book was being written. This extraordinary story was narrated to me by his son, Commodore Udakkal Johnson, as we hunted amidst torrential monsoon rain for an almost forgotten memorial for World War I sailors in Mumbai's old port area. Sadly, he passed away a couple of months ago. He was alive when I wrote this, but he passed away before the book was published. This book is concerned with the past, but the wheels of history roll relentlessly forward. What does the future hold? Even as I was completing this book, there were signs that the Indian Ocean may become the theater of a new geopolitical rivalry between India and China. Those who remember history will know that the Indian Ocean has seen the likes of Rajendra Chola and Jung-He before. They will also know to expect the unexpected. After all, no one who saw Jung-He's magnificent treasure fleet would have believed that a few decades later, a small country in the Iberian Peninsula would open up the Indian Ocean to centuries of European domination. If there is one lesson from history, it is this: time devours the greatest of men and the mightiest of empires. Thank you.
I have my mic back.
The floor is open for questions if anybody would like to ask.
Why don't we have a conversation first and then
Yes,
we
sir.
can do that? Yeah.
Okay, I mean, in reading the book, I found the history of the eastern coast of India, the entire coastline. So whether this is Tamil Nadu or Odia or Bengal, fascinating. All the connections leading up to Indonesia. I was surprised to learn that we had even invaded Indonesian islands. And so maybe you could just talk about that a little bit. If you want to say something about Ashoka, I found that a new perspective.
Okay.
So anything on the eastern coast, and then we can look at something else.
Sure. I mean, the eastern coast of India, of course, is fascinating because there's an enormous amount of trade going on from at least the Iron Age. And the real stars of this are the Uriya. They start out from, begin to make these voyages along the coast. And one of those guys go all the way down and they begin to settle Sri Lanka. So the Sinhalese, who are now the majority population of Sri Lanka, actually are of Uriya Bengali origin. And now, of course, genetics and other things will also prove that. And on the other side also, they begin to, so people from that sort of Uriya general East Coast area begin to also go the other way. And by at least maybe the 2nd century BC or somewhere thereabout, they make their way to along the coast. And remember now, at this stage, they're still unable to cross the seas right through across. So they're hugging the coast here. And they go off towards Thailand. And there's a little bit called the Isthmus of Kra, where Malaysia hangs from it, if you know geography of that area. They went across by foot onto the other side, and then again began to sail on the other side towards the Mekong Delta, where it is southern Vietnam and so on. And there is a legend about this interaction. And I'm going to tell you this legend because it's quite interesting. So the legend is that there was an Indian ship sailing along the Mekong Delta, which is now southern Vietnam, or Cambodia, that general area. And the ship was attacked by local pirates. And the Indians fought them back very hard. They were led by a Brahmin called Kaundinya. And they pushed the pirates back. But unfortunately, their ship was obviously leaking, and there was a problem. So they had to take it to shore for repair. So when they brought it to the shore, unfortunately, a local snake tribe or Naga tribe surrounded them. And there was going to be another great battle. So just when things looked quite hopeless, it stopped because the local Naga tribe was led by a warrior princess, Soma, who fell in love with Kaundinya and proposed marriage. Now I suppose Kaundinya didn't have too much choice in the matter at this stage. But he accepted the marriage, and they got married. And this is how a dynasty was founded. And this dynasty would, in various ways, end up ruling both the Chams of Vietnam and the Khmers of Angkor for many centuries afterwards. But interestingly, two things. One, this was a matrilineal dynasty. So it was from their daughter and daughter's daughter that the royal lineage was counted. And I've started the book actually with a story about how this dynasty may even have come back to India in a sense that the Pallavas possibly derived their royal legitimacy from a marriage to a Naga princess from Southeast Asia. And in fact, much later on, they even imported a king, Nandivarman II, who was one of the greatest kings of southern India, but he was most likely either Malay or Cambodian. And his story is written in a temple in Kanchi, where he is given this. You should visit it, it's beautiful. So this is the history of this area. Now, one thing of course comes out here, who was Kaundinya? Now, Kaundinya is not a common first name, but it is a Gotra. And this Gotra is found from basically along the coast of northern Tamil coast, along the Andhra coast to southern Odisha. So my guess, we can't prove it, my guess is that he was somebody from this general area who went there in the 2nd century BC.
Okay, the second thing is of course the story of Martandavarma and Queen Abaka, and so maybe you could talk a little bit of the struggles of the Portuguese on the western coast.
Yeah, okay. So, one of the interesting things is that our history books always give us the impression that, every time some foreign invader came, we just gave over. And of course, this bias has been inflicted by colonial historians to try and prove to us that we were a bunch of losers. So you'll hear about the 3 battles of Panipat, and you'll hear about the Battle of Plassey, but you'll never hear about the battles we won. But the reason we are still around as a civilization is because we won quite a lot of these battles, and one of the things that I try to do in this book is to bring some of them up. One of these, of course, these stories of resistance happen along the western coast. So since we are going to talk about the Portuguese and Dutch period, there are these amazing characters who have been forgotten to history, or at least most people will not hear about them. For example, the 3 queens of Ullal, first of whom was called Abakka Rani. So Rani Abakka was the queen of a very tiny kingdom in near Mangalore, and she put up this amazing resistance against the Portuguese for decades till she was killed. But that battle was then carried on by her daughter and granddaughter. So for almost a century they resisted Portuguese rule. But again, this story is there, I think, in one Amar Chitra Katha and 1 or 2 local traditions, but it's simply not there in any textbook that I could find. But there is not even a proper history in English on Rani Abakka. But even more shocking is the complete deletion of Martandavarma from our history. So now, unless you happen to be from southern Kerala, you probably have never heard of Martandavarma. But Martandavarma is not just a character of importance to Indian history, but to world history. So you went back to the early 18th century. The most powerful multinational company on the planet was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. And these guys were basically taking over Asia. So they had taken over Indonesia, they had taken over Sri Lanka, and now they wanted to capture the Kerala coast because that was where the pepper came from. Because after that, they were basically controlling all the spices. So when they began to do this, they came against resistance from a small kingdom along the coast, which later became Travancore, and its king, Martandavarma, who challenged them. And there was a great battle at a place called Kolachal, where Martandavarma totally defeated the Dutch. And it was such a shock to the Dutch that from that point onwards, the VOC went into decline, and it opened up space for the French and ultimately the East India Company of the English. Now this is obviously a world event, changed the course of history. Not only that, for the next 2 centuries or so, no Asian power would defeat a European power. So in 1905, the Japanese would defeat the Russians, and this is a major world event which many history books talk about. But nobody talks about the previous time that, this was the first time that the Asian power defeated a European power. But what was the last time this has happened? And it was Martandavarma against the Dutch. But that is sort of totally wiped out of our memory.
Yeah, rather depressingly, his victory arch
Yeah,
totally
it was-
dilapidated and
No, well, it
probably
was.
has cinema posters over it.
Yeah, well, it's a column actually.
Okay.
And when I visited it, it was really horrible. It was just a column with garbage lying around, literally garbage lying around it. Then, maybe 20 yards away there was a urinal. And this is one of the great sites of world history in Kolachal. Thankfully, what's happened is that the Madras regiment has one battalion or some section which is derived from Martanda Varma's army. It's a survivor from his time. And they took it upon themselves to clean the place up. So today, I believe, I have not seen it myself, I believe in the last 1 year they cleaned it up. And so it's not so bad, but I was shocked that that was the state, that column was in.
Okay, that's good to hear. In the book, one gets the sense that, there's this idea that history basically follows from the initial conditions.
Yes.
If you have one country industrializing, another one not, then it's a one-way street. There'll be the odd bump, but it'll happen. But in fact, what surprisingly happens very often is that history turns on a dime.
Yes.
Some random person, motivated by nothing more than his own personal interests,
Yes.
suddenly upsets entire empires and all. And this randomness makes it very spicy, shall we say.
Yes.
The whole history of, the Indian Ocean even. Perhaps you'd like to elaborate on that, the surprising tendency of small events to disturb this big
Yes,
picture.
so, all history is ultimately written from some perspective or some philosophy. So there is, of course, the great man theory of history, which is that history is written from the perspective of, great individuals. So whether it's the Mughal emperors or Gandhi or whatever, Churchill or whoever it is. And there is, of course, as a response to that, there was, of course, the other option, which is that you think of history as this grand socio-economic machine. Which is, of course, one example of that is, of course, the Marxist view of history. Now, I have taken a completely different view of history, using chaos theory, and pulling out of that specifically something that I use in both my economics and in my urban design work, which is called complex adaptive system. But basically, it's about a whole bunch of independent things, which could include individuals, great and not so great. It could include grand economic, sociological movement. But it could be terrain and geography, it could be climate change, it could be randomness, complete pure chance. And the interactions between these is what defines history. So consequently, there's a lot of unintended consequences happening all over. And I'll give you one example of it, but my book is full of these. So you went back to the 1400s, that's the 15th century, the early 15th century. The most important naval power in the world by some long margin were the Chinese. I mean, they just had technology that was miles ahead of everybody else. And in the early 1400s, there was an admiral, eunuch admiral, interestingly. So this eunuch admiral called Admiral Zheng He, who led these huge voyages down the coast through Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean. And these were really massive. I mean, you're dealing with 28,000 people in these massive ships. Some of these ships were like 5-6 times the size of what Columbus was using. And the idea was not exploration. This is very important because the routes he was using were very well known for almost 1,000 years by this time. So he came in, and basically they come in these series of voyages, and the idea is to impose Chinese hegemony, to sort of impress the locals with the sheer power of Chinese naval technology. And they do that. So for a while, they are able to move things around, change kings, and help one group against another, and so on. And very quickly, the Chinese become very, very powerful in the Indian Ocean. Something they are perhaps trying to do now. They had actually achieved it then. Now, however, something bad happens to this whole thing goes into a random direction. What happens is that the Chinese emperor dies, and the new emperor is more sympathetic to the Confucian mandarins in the court. And the Confucian mandarins are very, very suspicious of all the eunuchs, because the eunuchs derive their power from the navy. And so, as a, you can think of it, the IPS versus IAS having a battle, in which basically one side basically decides that the other side's power comes from naval power. And so the Confucian mandarins systematically undermine the Navy. So much so that the records of these voyages are actually suppressed. It's only in the 20th century that we've begun to relook at them. And the fleet is basically destroyed or rots. Now, as a result of this, of course, the Chinese begin to withdraw out of the Indian Ocean, and by the second half of the 1400s, Chinese naval power basically has disappeared from the Indian Ocean. Now, this is the environment in which Vasco da Gama turns up. So, if he had come a couple of decades earlier and found the Chinese there, he would have got completely destroyed because the Chinese had much bigger fleets. But because of their own political rivalries, they had withdrawn, and this had left open this space, and the Portuguese turned up. So suddenly, because of this completely random event in Beijing, you have a small country in the Iberian Peninsula basically taking over all of the Indian Ocean. And so this is what the point about this history is. The history simply continuously sees these kinds of random turns, and this is an important part of understanding how the world has turned out.
Okay, from Chennai's perspective, I think maybe you can just tell us the story of the Emden, and then maybe the audience can take some questions.
Okay. How many of you know the story of the Emden? Let's see. Okay. More than I expected, because when I came researching this book, I actually was trying to find people who knew something about the Emden. I found very few, and they certainly couldn't tell me about the memorial to the Emden that is there just outside the High Court. Some of you may actually know about this. But basically, we think that India did not participate very much in the First World War. That's what we have given the impression. But in very recent times, I think people have begun to rediscover the fact that the bulk of the so-called British Army was actually Indian. And at Gallipoli and many other places, it was the Indian Army, Indian soldiers who were doing most of the fighting. That is slowly beginning to come up. But even then, we are still left under the impression that India itself, nothing happened. That is also not true. So one of the episodes that happened, which is important, is of course the fact that there was a German cruiser that found itself, when the war started in 1914, it found itself stuck on the coast of China. And so it decided to fight its way back to the Mediterranean, or at least to the Red Sea, or wherever they wanted to go ultimately, through the Indian Ocean. Now, the British had no idea about this ship called the Emden. It was a very good cruiser, light cruiser, and with a captain who was really skilled. So these guys suddenly turned up in the Bay of Bengal and began to sink all these British ships. And one fine morning, they actually turned up, then called Madras, of course, and bombarded the city. And for a period of time, they set ablaze all the fuel tanks along the harbor, and there was absolute panic. And the word Emden then entered Tamil vocabulary. I believe it's again fallen off, but those who still was a little bit older will know that the term came to mean somebody who was extremely cunning or something like that. Daring. Okay. So that is the origin of this word. But anyway, having bombarded Madras harbor, they then went off to an island called Diego Garcia, which is in the Indian Ocean. It's a tiny island. It's still used as a British-American port. And because communication was so bad, they actually turned up there and resupplied themselves from the British. Because nobody knew that the war had started yet. So they got themselves coaled up. And then they went off to Penang, which is near Singapore. It's a harbor near Singapore. And they bombarded that place as well and sank a bunch of ships. Then again came out, fought their way through, sank a whole bunch of other ships. And then they got trapped near the Coco Islands. It's just north of Australia, where another large cruiser, which was even more modern than it was, called the Sydney, basically, the Australian ship basically caught up with it, and there was a big battle, and the Emden was sunk. But this is a fascinating history of maritime history, history that involves, of course, Chennai itself. again, I thought I'll bring up in this book. When I came researching this book, by the way, I had driven down the Kerala coast and up the Tamil coast, and I had come to Chennai and spent quite some time wandering around, and I was really looking for a memorial or somebody who knew something about it. And ultimately, outside the High Court, you know where all those cell phones, etc., are sold across the street? Well, just across from it, along the wall of High Court, there is actually a small plaque there, memorial to the bombing by the MDill. It's still there. So if you happen to be going to that area, do look it up.
Yeah.
Madras had actually been evacuated consequent of that for several months.
Yes.
And
that's-
the word evacuation came into Tamil usage. People used to talk about the period of evacuation.
Oh, okay, there you go.
So there you go. You're absolutely right. It was actually a very major event in the lives of people of this city at that time.
Many left for the hinterland.
Yes.
And the small skeleton families stayed here.
Yes.
People had evacuated.
Yes. So it was a very, very major event. So I'm quite surprised that it has almost dropped off the memory of younger people, because when I came here last, I did find finally one or two people who knew about this.
No, when I was young, it was a nickname to be used against the bold guy. I
Okay.
would call a bold guy.
Yeah,
We
okay.
used to call him, he's an MDill.
Okay, there you go.
Using the handle in my time.
So not only did I not know that India's participation in World War I was much heavier, but I didn't even know that Indians were historically mercenary soldiers, and that Alexander had to execute a whole regiment of them for refusing to attack India. Anyways, I think maybe the audience can take some questions now.
Yeah, okay. If there's another mic, we can sort of take it around.
Kindly raise your hands, we'll release the mic to you.
I have a question,
Yes.
but that is to Mr. Anand. This is not related to this book. Actually, I have been trying to ask him for several months or years. Actually, according to Malcolm Gladwell, his book, The Outlier, Story of Success, you being a grandmaster in chess, we often quote you as an outlier, that you have achieved something extraordinary. So he says that in the book, The Outlier, there is a 10,000 rule, 10,000 hours rule.
I think this is better kept for another occasion. This is a fascinating book, and we probably just have a few minutes to explore it. So I think it would be best to be
Focus on the end. The end. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Your Rajendra Chola and how he was support merchants, both Rajaraja Chola and.
Okay. Okay, so there are two bits to it. I think you want to know about the commercial environment of that time.
I was an impression, or I.
You need to speak into the mic, I can't hear you.
So the voyage was more to support the trade rather than to conquer places.
So I think you're talking about the raid he made on Srivijaya. Okay. Well, actually there were 3 raids and I'll come to that. But first, one thing you have to realize that there was enormous amount of trade going back and forth, all the way from Egypt through to India, the Fatimids of Egypt through to India, and then all the way through Southeast Asia to China. It was a massive amount of trade going back and forth between all these countries. And by the way, this trade was not done by individual traders to a large extent. This was extremely well-oiled machinery, and they were literally corporatized guilds. One of them called the 500, and various other names are there, I've given in the book. So it was not, there were of course some individual traders, but these were corporatized guilds, and the corporatized guilds had contracts with artisan guilds who manufactured things which they got, and they also had contracts with temples who were the financiers. You get the impression that the temples were rich because the kings were giving them a lot of gold. Some of the seed money may have come from the kings, but the real reason the temples had so much gold and they were rich because they acted like banks and they were financing all these guys. That's why there's so many of the banks, major temples along the coast, including Somnath and so on. So this was a big machinery that was chugging along. Now there was a place there was a choking point in Southeast Asia for this trade. The rest of it is open, but in Southeast Asia you have choking points. So there were two routes that you had to take to go to China, and one was the Malacca Strait between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, which was controlled by the Srivijaya, the Sumatrans, and the other one was the Sunda Strait, which is controlled by the Javanese. Now what happened is that using Chinese support of the Song dynasty in China, the Sumatrans beat the Javanese. So what happened is that they ended up controlling both the channels. So now, having got control of both, they began to impose enormous tariffs on all of the trade that went back and forth. Now this caused a lot of consternation, I suppose, to the others. And Rajendra Chola seems to have sent one warning fleet, which was not much given heed to. So then a much bigger expedition set sail from Nagapattinam, went down across and basically sacked a bunch of Srivijaya forts, and ultimately in a place called Kadaram, which is now the Kedah province in Malaysia, the northern Malaysia, there was a big battle in which he defeated the Srivijaya, and then he came back. And after that, of course, the shipping lanes got cleaned up. There is some reason to believe he may even have managed to put his own nominee on the throne, because later on there was another voyage after Rajendra Chola which had gone there to support the Srivijaya against local rivals. So it's possibly that they were basically supporting their own candidate or dynasty or whatever. So yes, you're right, there were these great voyages, and yes, it was related to trade. But you have to know that these were grand alliances that were networked across the Indian Ocean. So they are not individual sailors and merchants. These are corporatized multinational guilds. There are huge geopolitical networks, which included the Cholas plus their allies in Southeast Asia. But of course, they had their enemies, which included the Pandyas of Madurai and their allies, the Sinhalese. So in fact, given modern history, we tend to think of Sri Lankan history as a battle between the Tamils and the Sinhalese, but in fact that is not how it comes out. If you read the history, it's really about the Pandya-Sinhalese alliance versus the Chola-led alliance.
How did you go about writing a book?
That's a good question. Well, it's a story of the Indian Ocean, which is not so surprising. I'm an Indian Ocean person. I was born in Calcutta. I worked for years in Mumbai, and then now I live in Singapore for many, many years. So I've lived all around this region, and I obviously have, being a history buff, I've collected a lot of information about it. But it's only about 2012 that I began to do systematic information collection. In the old days, of course, you have to spend a lot of time in the library, but the good news these days is, thanks to Google, online, amazing amount of papers, particularly on genetics, climate change, etc. is available, so that saves a lot of time. Also, Amazon helps, because you can simply buy whatever the e-books quite easily. You still have to go to libraries, but not so much as in the past. But what I did invest my time in doing, other than buying the books and reading the material, was traveling to all these locations. So all the books, if you read my book, you will see I've been to some 80% of those locations. So as I told you, I drove down the Kerala coast, went up the Tamil coast, I drove all over the coast of Odisha, I went all over Gujarat, I went to Oman, I visited Zanzibar. I of course live in Southeast Asia, so I went to many places, Angkor, Borobudur and so on, which I had done before I started research, but I went to one or two other places as well. So if you read the book, you will get, I hope, a clear impression of my own, the feeling of being in these places. Because what I want to do is to break people away from the idea that history is something that happened and historians read about, whereas in fact it's a living thing. I mean, if you visit some of these places, there are folk tales that are there. There are things that you can experience that no amount of book reading will ever let you. So you actually have to go to some of these places, then you really feel it. And of course, you live along one of those most evocative coastlines. You go to Trankebar, you almost feel that this is a abandoned Danish outpost. So I'm a big believer in visiting places and experiencing the place.
How does one verify or confirm that the information given in the pages of, say, Google, it is correct?
No, so obviously I'm not doing a random Google search. I am only taking on the once I've done it, you get a lot of rubbish as well. You get Wikipedia, which sometimes is right, sometimes not. So the links that are given, and they are extensive links, are of scholarly papers that have been published in a reputable journal, or a book that I bought off Amazon. So then you don't buy any old book, you buy the ones that are. Sometimes you can get Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo. These are standard books that you can buy. So yes, no, just because it pops up on Google, no. I mean, obviously, you have to spend some time making sure the sources are credible.
Hello. Here, in fact, in this book, The Ocean of Churn, you talked about how the merchants, the Indian merchants based in South India, they went on from ocean-based to shore-based at some point of time.
Yes.
Here I would like to ask a question regarding the society, the Tamil society in general. Towards the end of the demise of Chola dynasty, it is said that the Tamil society was divided vertically into right-hand caste and left-hand caste. It is essentially the farming guild versus the artisan guild. Do you think that that dichotomy is what which led to the fall in the South Indian trade guilds in general, and thereby leading to the merchants being shore-based because they don't get the adequate support from temples?
I've tried to delve in, not just in this book, but before as well, because here is a country with an amazing maritime past, okay? And then somewhere after this great period of Chola power, we suddenly withdraw. I'll have to clarify here. It is mostly the Hindus who withdrew. The Muslim communities continue to have somewhat of a more maritime orientation. But the Hindus literally just withdrew out of it and became shore-based. Not entirely, there were individuals like the Kachis continued to travel to Oman and so on, but by and large it is true. And I have never been able to quite understand it, and I have really investigated it in many times to understand the psychological shift that would cause this. Now the conventional thought is, it's Brahminical, some sort of imposition, closed-mindedness, but it doesn't make sense because earlier also we were Hindus and they were traveling. In any case, all the castes were benefiting. So the artisans benefited from the export, the merchants obviously were the people exporting, the ruling the castes obviously benefited from tax that we're collecting, and the Brahmins themselves are one of the biggest beneficiaries because they were in huge demand in Southeast Asia. And in fact, the whole thing started with the Brahmin Kondinya, as I pointed out. So this caste-based explanation doesn't work, and yes, you gave me the example of right-hand and left-hand caste, but that doesn't happen, say, in Odisha, or doesn't happen in other places. But this sudden withdrawal happens everywhere. So I don't know the answer to your question. One part of it is certainly that the sacking of the temples by the Turks certainly meant that financial backing of Indian merchants suddenly disappeared because the banking sector basically got destroyed. So that is part of the story. But then you have to know that, other places have also faced this. So the Chinese, for example, also saw the Mongols roughly the same time destroying. The Arabs had a similar experience by the Mongols, by the way. Baghdad was sacked by the Mongols and there was a real mess there. So others also faced this. Now different communities reacted to this in different ways. The Chinese reaction to it was to build the great treasure fleet and project power. Once they've thrown these guys out, they projected power. The Indian response to it was to somehow look down on foreign trade and close themselves in. So I suppose it could just be a colossal loss of civilizational confidence after these Turkic invasions. I don't know. I'm really grasping at straws here, but it is, you're right, a major shift civilizationally, and it's extremely mysterious because the most conventional explanations simply don't hold water. Yes.
Hello. I just want to ask you one question. You were talking about how the people of the East, how the textbooks they have a regular pattern and they just show you what they think is important. And with you have the associate, you've connected so many of them to write such a book. I just want to ask you, are there any other any other things of the history that we are not aware of? And do you think, or do you see any time in the near future that we see the past in the textbooks as given and not what is being reiterated?
So, yes, so part of the book obviously is to unwind the Western view of things. It's amazing the extent to which colonial era biases continue in our textbooks. And after independence, things like the Aryan invasion theory, etc., other countries also had their equivalents. I mean, the Africans were told about the Hamitic invasion theory, which is basically the same thing. But after independence, every country basically unwound these biases in their own way and told their own story. In fact, there is an African saying which says that as long as the lions do not have their storytellers, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So, so other people have also faced this problem and unwound it. Unfortunately, after independence, we didn't correct these biases. In fact, instead we added further biases of the Nehruvians and the Marxists and so on. So net result of this is that our history is basically a real mess. And of course we have, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the big Delhi-centric bias as well. So this is a serious issue. Hope some of it will unwind through this book. Obviously, in this book I have taken on a character like Ashoka, who I don't have a particularly positive view, and I've given the Odia view of the events. And hopefully you'll read it and you will see. But these things are not only about major characters and major biases. It is so systematic that sometimes even you cannot even notice it. And I'll give you some examples of it, which are not related to this book, because I hope you'll read the book and decide on the merits. I'll give you some other examples. So, for example, in our own history books, we tend to call, Chanakya as Machiavellian. Or we'll have Samudragupta was the Napoleon of India. Now when I call Napoleon of India, Indians get very happy. Hey, Napoleon ke saath compare karte. Very good, Napoleon. But actually the British historians were trying to say something totally different. After Samudragupta was one of the great generals and emperors of India. He came from Pataliputra all the way down. He defeated the Pallavas as well and made them pay him this thing. Then he directly controlled, he threw out the Sakas and the Bactrians and the Indo-Greeks from Western India, and he basically consolidated. And so, as a result of that, the Guptas directly or indirectly ruled all of India. Now, so he was not a trivial guy. So there was no way for the British historians to simply wish him away. So what were they doing by calling him Napoleon as opposed to, say, Julius Caesar of India or Peter the Great of India? Basically, the message was the following. You see, in the 19th century, the British were very, very proud of having defeated Napoleon repeatedly. And the message to an Indian audience was the following. Samudragupta may have been a very great general, but if he had been around, we would have defeated him too. And this happens very systematically and subtly all the time. So you have great Chanakya, but he is Machiavellian. But Machiavelli, if you read his stuff, he's actually a very small-time political advisor in a tiny place called Florence, which was even smaller than Chennai. So the point of the matter is, why compare him to one of the great empire builders, not only of Indian history? He built what was then the largest empire in the world. And there's nothing Machiavellian about the Arthashastra, incidentally. So this is a very subtle undermining of our heroes, the great characters of our Indian history, by simply subtly undermining them. And okay, I understand why the colonial era guys did it. The funny bit is not that they did it, is that we perpetuate it. And sometimes we are proud of it also, as I pointed out.
Maritime history in India, how come we have very few sculptures or paintings of boats or ships or sailors? It's always bothered me. Could you throw some light on this?
So this is quite interesting. That maritime history, incidentally, is very richly described in our folklore, particularly that of Odisha, which I will come to. But it is true, there is a lot of description of maritime trade in the Sangam literature, for example, full of maritime trade. There are also other things that hint towards the clear evidence of trade. So, for example, Konarak temple has a large giraffe being presented to the king. So clearly there's trade going on. And obviously there is the evidence on the other side of Indians going to Southeast Asia. On the Indonesian side, there are lots of sculptures. In Borobudur, there's a beautiful sculpture of a ship which is there on the cover of my book. But you're absolutely right, it's quite peculiar, and there are actually oddly few artistic representations of Indian seagoing ships. There are artistic representations of ships, but they seem not to be seagoing ships because they seem to be very much oar-driven and not sail-driven. So yes, I agree with you. This is one of these odd things of history which I cannot explain. Maybe there were representations which have disappeared or destroyed by time. But you are absolutely right, this is one peculiar thing. But having said that, other things have remained which are very, very strong echoes of this maritime tradition. And this is particularly true of Orissa. So they have one of the biggest festivals in Orissa is something called Kartik Purnima. Now Kartik Purnima happens in the Purnima in November. And the festival constitutes of the women particularly, but also the families turn up at dawn, a little before dawn, at the seashore or river shore or something, and they put small paper boats in the river with lamps on them. And at the same time, they have a fair called Bali Yatra. It's a general, like a big fair. Now for a long time, nobody really knew what the significance of doing this was, but it is literally the biggest festival in Orissa other than the Jagannath festival. Now it turns out the reason this happens is that this was a memory of the time when the Odia sailors used to set sail for Bali. That's why Bali Yatra. And why does it happen at this time? Well, I actually went to Orissa for this festival, and I sat on the beach outside Konarak Chandrabhaga beach, which was in ancient times a major port area. And I witnessed it, and it's blatantly obvious if you see it for yourself. The wind blows from the north. You see, till October the wind blows from the south, and then it switches to blowing from the north. So, you see, what were the Odia doing? They were sailing down the coast using this thing to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was only a staging point because, you see, you didn't sail directly across. The way they went to Southeast Asia, to Bali, was they sailed down the coast to Sri Lanka. There they got in food and water, etc. And from there, there's an ocean current that flows across to Sumatra. So that is the way they used to go. And this is a memory of that time when they used to do this. And so when they're putting these lamps out with these in the boats, basically it's symbolic of the women and family of the traders bidding goodbye to the merchants as they set off. And of course the tradition is that you wait till the sun rises and you watch the sunrise. But basically what is going on here is this ship set sail in the early morning breeze, and then you basically wait to say goodbye as they sort of go off the horizon. And it's very, very obvious. In fact, they also have plays they do. There's a play of dedicated to called the play of Topoi. It's a legend of a young girl whose father and brothers go off on a long voyage. So it's very strongly maritime. So I'm amazed that people do not make more of a fuss of it. Now, of course, in recent times, even the Odia have begun to rediscover this route. And of course, there's this fair called the Bali Yatra, which literally means the voyage to Bali.
I have two questions.
Yes.
Which age group you had in mind when you wrote this book as a targeted audience? One. Second, what is your views on making this younger generation to develop interest on history?
This is book meant for everybody who's young at heart. It is not a academic textbook, deliberately not so. I've tried to maintain academic level research, but I've made sure that the style is friendly. I hope the humor has worked, but there's a bit of humor in there, and so on and so forth. I think anybody above the age of 18 should be quite comfortable. I have even known 16-year-olds to read it, but let's say 18-year-old plus should have no difficulty with this book at all. So the age group should not be, and it is for a general reader. I've tried quite hard to not be technical, so although there's a lot of technical stuff here on genetics, climate change, and so on, I have given the references for those who want to follow it. They're all clearly given. You can go on and Google the original papers. But I have tried to be as accessible as I can, and still maintain the sense of the of what I'm talking about.
If you look at the Western coast, there was this, for Muslims there was lots of trade happening for maybe a couple of thousands of years at least. But we always hear only from Vasco da Gama onwards, and we don't even hear much about having any naval presence on the Western coast. Shouldn't that have been natural to have?
Yes, there is in fact plenty of evidence of naval presence on the west before Vasco da Gama. In fact, the Sangam literature has a reference of a Chera king who captured a bunch of Greek merchants and held them for ransom. And there's also, he fights a naval battle with an unmentioned adversary and defeats him. So there are very old references going back a long, long way. There are other signs of this, of course, merchant naval activity. I talked, of course, Rajendra Chola, but the western coast, since you're talking about, the Marathas actually had a very active navy. So, and I do talk about that, and they for several decades gave hell to the British and the Portuguese in several occasions, sinking their fleets and extracting toll and doing all kinds of things. There were also non-Indians and non-Europeans operating in this area. So, for example, there were the Sidis, who were pirates, the Ethiopian pirates operating out of a place called Murur Janjira, which is just south of Bombay. So there's plenty of guys, naval activity going on along the coast of the west coast of India. Both merchant, as we said, but also military naval activity. Yes.
We'll take final two questions. One there. Yeah. Please go ahead.
So a while back you talked about research, that is, in case you want to research about a place, you actually try and visit those places to get a feel of it. So when is it that you decide that this is going to be enough research for me? And the second aspect to it is like, there is a specific amount of time that I'm going to dedicate, because when we turn pages of research, it kind of just goes into layers. So when do we know that this is like...
Okay, you have touched a very raw nerve for every writer. Because if you're a writer, one of the problems is, of course, precisely this. I mean, the logistics of doing this. And of course, it's not chronological, because one place may have, you may be writing chapter 3 where a location is important, but it also will turn up in chapter 8. But you haven't done the research for chapter 8, but you only have the time to go and visit the place now. So, you have to scramble around, learn something. So these are decisions, these are human decisions, not research decisions. Very often they are logistical decisions that you have to make. So yes, you're absolutely right. There is this issue comes up. Anybody writing this kind of book faces it all the time, and there are decisions you have to make. But also there is the other problem that I found, which is what do you leave out? Because when you're writing a book like this, you actually collect heaps of information, and maybe not more than 40% of the stuff I found I actually have written about. Now, you see, if you spend a lot of effort digging out a piece of information or evidence, it becomes almost like a child. And you can't leave that child out of the book because you put in so much effort, but then you discover at the end that actually doesn't fit the story. So there's a temptation here of somehow finding some random way of getting the story in. But then, this is the discipline of a writer, is that in the end you have to be disciplined about it, and if it doesn't fit the story, tough. And my book is not an encyclopedia, therefore a lot of emphasis on keeping the story moving. Otherwise, you're not going to turn the page as a general reader. So this business of not going off in tangents too much, but at the same time enough detail to give you a flavor of things. So let me give you one example. It's not about places or anything, about something else that I wrote in the book right at the beginning, which I really struggled about, which is to write about the philosophy of history. Now, I mean, now that I've written the book, and many people are those who like the book and said, yeah, great, you wrote about the philosophy of history in the book. But let me tell you, I struggled with this because, if I had put in a subsection called philosophy of history, as a writer, I am afraid that, the average reader will say, oh my God, no, and shut it and go off. So I had to struggle with this, that I did include a very simplified version of what a complex adaptive system framework is in there, and about chaos theory. Now those who are into it You can read my other writings, or there are plenty of other people who write about chaos theory and Chombley-Zerako systems. But I have applied it in a certain way in this book, in as light a touch as possible, without, making it trivializing. So these are the things a writer does. So that's the art of the writing.
It's nice to be the last person to ask a question. I don't need a mic as well. Is it true that the South Indian, especially Chola, used the maritime route to reach the Himalayas via Kamakya, Assam? Is that, or is...
No, I have not seen that evidence. The evidence is that they reached the banks of the Ganga. It is possible that, so I do not, there are not the details of the campaign, of the logistics of the campaign are not clear. He obviously reached the Ganga and he brings back somewhere on the, I think the place he reached, I forget, but I think somewhere in the Bihar-Bengal border area, somewhere in that area, they reached the bank and then he came back. It is possible, my guess is that he marched the army along the coast with that naval thing going along the coast on the side, and probably made their way up what is now the Hooghly Channel. That is my best guess. But frankly, this is one of the problems of Indian history. You hear about, of any history writing in fact, of ancient history, anywhere in the world, but certainly in India, that you have random bits of information, and then you have to basically guess from some other way. Now, if it had been any other king, I would have said he marched his troops up. Because it is Rajendra Chola, and I know he has a navy, my guess is that he possibly also took a naval operation up the coast as well. Yes.
Rest of the guests can take it one-on-one after the event is over. It looks like as if the history class doesn't want to get over. On behalf of Odyssey and Penguin Random House, we would like to take this opportunity to thank Chief Guest Mr. Vishwanathan Anand and Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal for being here with us this evening. We would also like to thank all of you for making this evening memorable. We hope you have enjoyed it as we have done hosting it. Author will now sign copies of his books and also a small introduction can happen. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.